Uh, Today we start talking about the problem of universals. I'm going to start out by putting forward just a couple of simple definitions, lay out some different positions on the reality and status of universals. Universals, of course, as we've already touched on, are contrasted with particulars. So a universal is a putative entity which can be instantiated or exemplified by more than one thing at a specific moment of time. An example would be triangularity. So the idea is that triangularity can be exemplified by two distinct triangles at the very same time. So if you have triangle 1 here and triangle 2, so this one maybe is, well, it's not a very well-drawn triangle here. That's a little better. It's called a poorly drawn triangle. So you're supposed to understand that it has straight sides, even though they're not perfectly straight. Interestingly, it's hard to find any triangles that aren't poorly drawn to some degree. Right? I mean, if you use any kind of ruler or straight edge and draw, it's still going to be slightly uneven, right? Because, I mean, the ruler or straight edge can't be manufactured to be 100% straight either. It's highly unlikely that you would ever get one that was exactly straight. Maybe the only way to get a triangle is by like shooting 3 beams of light through space, so they intersect, and the sides of the triangle would be the light beams. It's not exactly a physical object triangle, but it's a triangle of a sort, right? And then there are those who say that gravity causes space to become bent to some degree, curve, so they wouldn't be perfectly straight either if there were any objects around too. So the upshot is there may not be any exact triangles in the world, which is an interesting observation, as we'll see, in terms of the debate about universals. But at any rate, so if you have triangle 1 here and 2, the idea is triangularity would be a universal because it's something that it's a property, an intrinsic property, an inherent property, not a relation or anything. It's a quality of both of these two different things at the same time. So you might say triangularity is shared by triangle 1 and triangle 2. And that's the characteristic that makes it a universal, if there is actually such a thing as triangularity. Most philosophers concede the existence of objects which might have shapes of various sorts, whatever shapes the objects have. So the existence of these objects of 1 and 2, the concrete objects or substances, 1 and 2 is generally admitted that these exist, at least within the context of this issue about universals. The controversy is, should we also posit or postulate the existence of triangularity as an additional entity over and above object 1 and object 2? Right? So should we countenance or admit the existence of shareable shapes in addition to objects over and above these objects? Even if they're not triangles exactly, because they're not exactly even or whatever. They have some kind of shape, right? Whatever. And so, in theory, then two objects could share exactly the same shape. Presumably, say, all electrons have the same shape, whatever that is. Right? They're all supposed to be identical in their properties as fundamental particles. The differences just come in when you start putting together the fundamental elements, and then you get things with different shapes. Some are spheres, some are rectangles, some are triangles, and so on, or whatever shapes they have. Any question so far about that? So there's been a lot of controversy about universals and whether they should be posited or postulated to exist in addition to concrete particulars. So there are some different views. According to concretism, only concrete entities exist. So they would deny the reality of a shareable universal, because a shareable universal would be an abstract entity, like triangularity. Right? Triangularity doesn't have any location, particular location in space. Doesn't seem to have spatial or temporal parts, even possibly. So it's quite abstract. According to concretism, only concrete entities exist. So they're against the existence of triangularity. They would say, well, object 1 and object 2 exist, but we don't need to also say object 3 exists, and in fact, object 3, triangularity, this third thing, doesn't exist in addition to the two objects. It's an unnecessary entity. So that's concretism. Now there are stricter forms of concretism. One of them would be reism, what I call reism, R-E-I-S-M. And that says that only substances exist, like object 1, object 2. Reism says that only substances exist. Reism, I guess, literally means thingism. Right? To reify is to make something into a thing, for example. So reism says that only things or substances exist, like a chunk of metal and a cat and object 1 and object 2 here and so on. These would be very, very thin things, right? That they don't come out very far off the blackboard. They're flat. But you're putting some matter on here, right? So there is a continuous thing there made of a thin layer of chalk. So the reism says only substances or things. And of course, all substances or things are concrete. So reism is a form of concretism. And an even more specific form is materialism. Materialism says that the only things that exist are bodies, material substances. So a reist might believe in the existence of souls. An example is the British philosopher George Berkeley. So he believed in the existence of spirits or souls and denied the existence of material substances. Leibniz held a similar metaphysical view, that souls, centers of conscious thought exist. They lack corporeal attributes. So That would still be a form of reism, but it wouldn't be materialism. Materialism says that everything that exists in the world is a material substance. So examples of philosophers who believe that are Thomas Hobbes and Karl Marx. Right? Remember, Marx held what was called dialectical materialism. So the idea is that everything in the world, according to Marx, is just a system of interacting bodies, and history is a function of those bodies and the laws of economics, or something like that, which produce various results. But it's all materialistic. There's no God. God is the opium of the people, Marx said, right? So he denied the existence of any spiritual substance. So I guess Marx might have described himself as a secular humanist. Didn't believe in any spiritual life. So that's materialism. This goes back to this view, back to ancient Greece. Democritus, the atomist, was a materialist, and so was his follower later on, Epicurus. Materialistic philosophers. This says only bodies exist. So if there's only bodies, then there wouldn't be triangularity, right? Because triangularity is not a body. The bodies are triangle 1 and triangle 2. But the triangularity is just somehow this immaterial, ethereal, shareable universal. Then you could have a view called particularism, which says that only particulars exist. This may be the same thing as what's generally referred to in the debate on universals and particulars as nominalism. Seems to be the same. The nominalist says there are only particulars, only particular things. Particularism is often blurs with concretism, and they're not always kept distinct. Or sometimes they're combined. The view is that only concrete particulars exist, but that would collapse into concretism. So nominalists and particularists say that there are no shareable qualities or relations, but only particulars. Particulars are things that cannot be, entities that cannot be shared by two or more things at a time. So if you have 3 dogs, Rover, Fido, and Spot, they'd all be particulars. You couldn't have like 3 Fidos or 3 Rovers or 2 Spots at the same time. You might have 3 dogs all named Rover, but that wouldn't be 3 Rovers. That would just be 3 different dogs that are named Rover. Whatever. Whereas with triangularity, you have 3 instances of the very same quality that are shared by the 3 different triangles, say, if you had 3 instead of 2. So thinking about these questions actually goes way back to Plato. So I want to start out with a brief historical overview. Plato had believed that there were certain eternal truths, most prominently eternal truths of mathematics, but also eternal truths of ethics as well. For example, in mathematics, Euclid had discovered and proved a number of eternal truths about geometrical objects. And these were not only eternal, but apparently necessary, unchanging, universal, absolute, knowable just through rational reflection on the proposition that expressed the truth, and so on. So what would be an example? Well, remember the Pythagorean theorem. Everyone familiar with that? The Pythagorean theorem puts forward, it's provable from certain self-evident principles of geometry, Euclid argued, that if you have a right triangle symbolized here, and the sides are called A, B, and C, where C is the hypotenuse of the right triangle. So what does the Pythagorean theorem say? Right, you got it. A squared plus B squared is equal to C squared. So this would never change. And the question is then, what has to exist in order for this to be true? Plato saw a big difference between what went on in the world of concrete particulars and these kinds of truths. Remember, these truths are eternal and unchanging and so on. But when he looked at the world of particulars, he found the exact opposite, that particulars are constantly in flux. They're constantly changing. So little pieces of chalk are blowing off of the board and stuff, right? Right? Little gusts of wind are carrying off little, right, microscopic pieces of chalk. And within the chalk itself, there are particles spinning around, right? As we now know, though Plato didn't maybe know that. But he was certainly correct then in his assumption that in the realm of particulars there's constant flux, which had been the doctrine of his predecessor Heraclitus. Heraclitus had said that you cannot step into the same river twice because the waters are constantly flowing on, and that the only constant in the world of particulars was change, somewhat paradoxically. Heraclitus was fond of paradox. But to him, that just reinforced the point that you can't find anything really stable in the world of particulars. As I alluded to shortly before, you can't even find a triangle, really, in nature. So then what is there in the world that makes it true eternally that a squared plus b squared equals c squared? We can't find any object in the world, in the natural world, that can explain the eternal, absolute, unchanging truth, since all the things in the physical world, the world of particulars, are relative, subject to change, and not absolute. Right? So Plato said there must be something else then. There must be another world to account for the truths of mathematics. And he made a similar argument about ethics. He said there are eternal ethical truths like bravery is a virtue or intelligence is a virtue, things like this. He said these are also eternal truths. Well, can we find anybody who's truly virtuous in the world to make these things true? Even Socrates seems to have had his flaws, right? He was extremely arrogant and impatient with his students and many other things. Even though he was a paragon of virtue, he wasn't perfectly virtuous. So it doesn't seem like we can find the kind of absolute necessity and perfection and, what shall I say, immutability in the world of, which means unchangeability. We can't find any of that in the world of particulars. So if we're going to recognize these ethical and mathematical truths, like intelligence is a virtue, how can these be necessarily true and absolute and unchanging if nothing in the world is like that? Well, he says there must be a world of objects that transcends the world of particulars. And he called this the world of forms. He said there's an additional realm to the universe, a dimension of the universe that contains absolute, unchanging, eternal forms. The term form was often translated as idea. So people talk about Plato's theory of ideas, but it's very misleading because we use the word idea nowadays to refer to a mental thing. And Plato did not have in mind anything mental when he spoke about the forms. He had in mind something, I think, that existed apart from the mind altogether. In virtue of which these truths of mathematics and these truths of ethics had their immutable, absolute characteristics as eternal truths. So Plato supposed then that there must be some absolute form of perfect triangularity that exists outside of the physical world, in virtue of which all triangles are triangles, and in virtue of which various eternal truths about triangles are true, like the Pythagorean theorem. And there must be an absolute form of virtue and an absolute form of intelligence and an absolute form of bravery, in virtue of which eternal truths like intelligence as a virtue and bravery as a virtue are eternal, absolute, unchanging truths. And this was the realm of forms. And so we can speak of Plato's theory of forms, which postulates these objects. So Plato's idea was that there's kind of like a heavenly realm called the Platonic heaven, where there exists these perfect, unchanging, absolute forms. So up there, there's a perfect square and a perfect circle and a perfect triangle, so on. And there would have to be a form for every kind of eternal, absolute truth. So maybe there are just forms for mathematical and ethical predicates. That would create a problem, though, right? Because then how would we explain what it was that made, say, Morris, Felix, and Garfield all cats, and Rover, Fido, and Spot all dogs, if we accept those as scientific truths? So I guess it'd be a question of where exactly the forms, where you stop having the forms. But Plato was committed at least to the mathematical and ethical forms, and perhaps to others as well. Forms of cats and dogs and various creatures and tables and chairs. And so on. Whenever a number of things fall under a common predicate, there would seem to have to be a form in virtue of which it's true that those objects all fall under that common predicate, whether the predicate is red or cat or dog or table or whatever it is. If the objects all fall into that common grouping, the Platonic theory of forms suggests that there's a common form that they all participate in. Plato spoke about objects participating in the forms. So what exactly did that mean for him? It seemed like for Plato, participation involve the idea of a model, an ideal model, and then things in the world which approximate to that model to some degree. So earthly triangles approximate rather closely to the ideal triangle, though we've seen they might fall short, right, because they're slightly uneven on one little spot or something. Right? But still, they come very close, right? So ideally, right, maybe you could create a triangle if you got lucky and you had really good equipment that was perfectly triangle. Then it would fully participate, in the form, but maybe that would never happen. So Plato seems to be suggesting here that objects in the world can be said to, I guess, imitate the form. So the relationship of participation seems to be one of imitation. And of course, imitation has that implication that the thing that's the imitator is not quite usually a perfect imitation or copy of the original. So the relationship here seems to be one of an original and a copy, where the copy bears resemblance, a strong resemblance, or possibly in some cases, though it's dubious, a perfect resemblance to the original, which is the form. So even if you wiped out all the earthly triangles, there would still be these eternal truths about triangularity in virtue of the perfect triangle existing outside of our natural world or spatio-temporal framework, existing in this heavenly realm of forms. So there are some odd things about this theory that Plato himself noticed in his later writings, where he engages in self-reflection and actually raises some criticisms of the theory that he puts forward initially. And what we're going to see is that his student Aristotle modifies the theory in various ways to get around these problems, and in so doing comes up with a theory that in many metaphysically significant ways is just a different theory than the original Platonic theory, though it does have also many important similarities to it, but it's a different account. Though it agrees in positing the existence of these, of some kind of shareable, non-natural kind of entity, or at least non-material kind of entity that exists apart from the mind as well, that accounts for things that can be grouped under a common predicate or fall into a common kind or category or group, something universal. The problem that Plato got into, that he pointed out, I should say, was that some of these forms seem to give rise to a kind of paradox. I mean, if we admit that there are things that aren't forms, like the triangles, as opposed to triangularity itself, then they would fall under the category of non-forms. Okay? And so there'd be a lot of things that are not forms, like this chair and that desk and that particular triangle and that particular triangle and that particular triangle and so on. These would all be non-forms. And then the question would arise, in virtue of what are all of these things non-forms? And the answer would have to be that they share a form, which is the form of being a non-form. So there'd be a form of unformedness, which itself would be not a form, because for Plato, all forms partake of themselves. For example, the form of a triangle is a triangle. The form of a perfectly straight line is a ideally perfect straight line. So the form of the non-form would have to be a non-form, which would make it both a form and a non-form at the same time. Contradiction, right? Aristotle brought up a related difficulty called the third man argument, which was alluded to in Plato as well, which said that if you have two men, Bill and Sam, then immediately you have a third man, which is the form of Bill and Sam, the humanity. So there'd be this ideal man that exists up in heaven. But he would be a man also, right? So now you'd have three men. You'd have Bill and Sam, the two earthly men, plus one heavenly man. So now we have three men, and we have to explain what makes the three all men. We explained why the first two were men by saying that they both imitate the heavenly man. But now we have three men, and we have to say what makes the three of them all men. So we have to posit a fourth man, heavenly man, which explains the three. And then we have four, and we have to posit a fifth to explain the four, and a sixth to explain the five. So we get an infinite regress of heavenly men here. And this is called the third man argument. So it seems like Plato's theory doesn't explain anything if we have to keep on bringing in more and more levels of men to explain the existence of men. One way this could be avoided would be, just to have, if we really restrict the number of forms there can be. But if we do that, the theory can't explain very much. And I guess you'd still get the argument even with triangles, right? Like if you had two earthly triangles and then a heavenly triangle, you'd have the three, and then you'd need a fourth one to explain why the group of three, including the heavenly one, had triangles. And then it's off to the races. So that seems unfortunate. But the real kicker, even if we're willing to accept an infinitude of all of these men, which seems like really bizarre, right, is the case of the non-form. Because there you seem to get a contradiction, which is deadly. Right? The theory seems to be self-contradictory. That there's a form of unformedness, which is both a form and therefore unformed. So the really objectionable feature of Plato's account of form seems to be that the forms are exemplars of themselves, that the thing that explains why all earthly things are triangular or are dogs or cats or whatever it is, that explainer itself has the property of falling within the class. There's a perfect cat, which is itself a cat in heaven. Perfect dog, which is itself in heaven. So that's what seems to make all the mischief here. And of course there are other doubts too, like what exact qualities would the perfect triangle or the perfect cat have? Like would the perfect triangle be a right triangle, or would it be an isosceles triangle? Right? These seem to be unanswerable questions. There seems to be no non-arbitrary way to answer them that makes any sense. And if you say, well, it's just a pure triangle of no particular sort, that seems impossible, right? It seems like if you're a triangle, right, even if it's an ideal triangle, it must be either an ideal isosceles triangle or equilateral triangle. It must be some kind of particular triangle that is. So Plato's idea that the forms are perfect exemplars which earthly things imitate. Another example he gave was that earthly things, illustration I should say, that the earthly things are kind of shadows of the forms. So they resemble them because they're sort of shadows that the forms cast on earth. And that's why they don't perfectly realize the forms, and that's why they're subject to change and relativity and aren't as absolute as the forms because they're shadows or images of those forms. But we still get these problems. So nowadays, really no one accepts Plato's theory as it was originally put forward. And it's not even clear that Plato did, because I say in the Parmenides he put forward many of these criticisms himself. He realized there was something wrong with the theory. So it was left to Aristotle, a student, to try to come up with something better. So the first move that Aristotle made was to say that these forms are not exemplars, they're not models which actually are of the kind that we're dealing with, right? So the triangularity, Aristotle said, is not a triangle. It is not itself triangular. What it is a property that triangular things have. But in most cases, properties do not exemplify themselves. You might find some case where they do, like the property of being a property. Right? Property of being a property is a property. So that would follow the Platonic model, and that it would be a property. But most properties, Aristotle said, are not instances of themselves. So triangularity, according to Aristotle, is not a triangle. Sphericity is not a sphere. Catness is not a cat. It's a quality. So it falls into a different category. So whereas the triangles and the cats and the spheres and all these things are substances, Aristotle said, properties fall into a whole other category. And so are different kinds of things. They fall into the category of properties. So that makes them a whole. They have a different essence than substances do. Yet there's an intimate relationship between the two. Aristotle famously introduces a distinction between form and matter. And he says that in order to have a substance, there has to be the matter of the substance, the stuff. So if you have a statue, there has to be the marble or the bronze, which is the stuff, which is a kind of substance that makes up the statue. And there also has to be a form or quality of being statuesque, so that the statue exemplifies. But Aristotle distinguished between the concrete individual substance and the quality of that substance, as well as distinguishing the matter of the substance. So the statue for Aristotle would be a fusion or combination of form and matter, and therefore different from both. This is Aristotle's view in his Metaphysics, that the concrete individual being is a unity of form and matter and is something which is sort of a composite or fusion of the two, and therefore differs from both the matter itself and the property or essence which the statue has. It wouldn't be the same as the matter, because you could imagine the matter existing, but without the unity provided by the form, the matter wouldn't constitute the object. So if you had a bunch of dog flesh, like after a dog was killed, it's like carcass, that wouldn't be a dog anymore, right? Especially after it decayed or whatever, right? It would just be like random parts, though it might be identical to the matter of the dog. You might have all the pieces of the dog there, right? The matter of the dog would still be. Well, you wouldn't have the dog. You wouldn't have your beloved pet Rover anymore. You just have these remains, right, that were laying there. So the matter isn't the same thing as the dog. The matter needs the unity provided by the form, by the property of being a dog. If it has that property, then the matter has to be organized in a way such that you get a dog. That makes sense. And the quality of dogness by itself isn't the same thing as Rover either, right? It's a quality. So to get Rover, we have to combine the property with the matter, get the matter to exemplify the property, and then you get a full-fledged individual substance or a dog out of that. So anyway, so Aristotle got rid of this idea that the forms exemplify themselves. That seems really deadly if you hold that. And Plato raised doubts about it himself based on the argument of the third man and also the argument of the contradiction. Plato's example of that was if there were forms of things like filth and decay and stuff like that. He said, how could those exist in a realm of perfect forms? Because then there would have to be filthy, dirty, decaying things in heaven. That was the way he put the point, raising the contradiction that would arise if we have a form for every predicate that we can apply to a group of things. We would get this contradiction. So once we abandon the idea that the forms exemplify themselves, we get out of this. And notice, too, that really thinking of the forms as things that exemplify themselves really makes the forms into particulars. They just become super particulars. But they're not really universals. I mean, if we imagine there's a perfect triangle in heaven, that perfect triangle would be a particular thing, wouldn't it? So it wouldn't really be a theory that posited universals at all. Not literally, because the entity up there would be a particular. We might say other things imitate that particular, but that's true of particulars on Earth too, right? I mean, you might have like the standard meter stick and lots of other kept in a glass bell in the Smithsonian Institute or at the Bureau of Standards or wherever they keep the standard meter stick by which all other meter sticks are, right, have to measure up to that standard. That doesn't make that meter stick into some kind of universal. It's still a particular thing. And the other meter sticks which resemble it are also particulars. So Plato's got a kind of hybrid view, right, of these heavenly particulars which explain the earthly particulars. He doesn't truly have the idea of a universal fully worked out yet here. So that comes with Aristotle. Aristotle, however, made another change. So the most important point or point of difference is that for him, properties, universals or forms become properties, which are not in general self-exemplifying. They don't partake of themselves. The properties of dogs and triangles are not themselves dogs or triangles. But he also held a different view of the relationship between these properties and things in the world. Plato had held that even if you destroyed all the particulars, the forms would still go on existing. That even if there were no triangles in the world, there would still be an absolute form of triangularity. Aristotle, though, does not adhere to this position. He maintains that forms are more intimately related to things in the world, such that a given form will only exist if some things possess or exemplify the form or property in question. In other words, Aristotle would say that if all dogs were to become extinct due to, say, a virus that kills off all dogs, then the quality of being a dog or dogness would cease to exist at that moment. So for Aristotle, a quality must have something that exemplifies it in order for the property to exist. Plato didn't hold that. He thought that universal properties could exist even without any examples of them. So for Plato, there would be the Platonic form of dragonhood and unicornicity and so on, whereas for Aristotle, those would not exist. Those would just be possible. There would be a possibility of those forms existing, maybe at some future time. Aristotle might say. He might say, well, in the distant past, there might have been unicorns or dragons, or in the far future, they might come to exist or whatever, or maybe on some other planet they could exist. But as far as we know, since they don't exist on Earth, we have no reason to believe in the existence of these qualities, like being a unicorn and being a dragon. Whereas Plato would say these definitely exist, because it doesn't matter whether unicorns or dragons actually exist. There's the ideal form of these things. Whether there are any actual examples or not is moot. It doesn't matter. Because there are eternal truths about unicorns and dragons, like that all dragons breathe fire, and that all unicorns have a single horn and are white and can only be seen by the pure-hearted. So that these would be necessary definitional truths that are eternal and unchangeable about unicorns and dragons. So there must be an absolute form that necessarily exists and is unchanging and absolute for each of these things, even if they don't actually have any concrete instantiations. Aristotle says no. Forms are intimately tied, or are properties which are intimately tied to substances, such that the form only comes into being when and only so long as at least one substance has that property. So for Aristotle, there'd be the property of dogness or canininity and the property of catness or felininity, but no property of unicornicity or dragonhood. Those would be merely possible to exist, but not actually existing, as far as we know. Any question about that? So those who follow Plato on this issue are called extreme realists about universals. So assuming we convert Plato's view to a belief in properties rather than a belief in these self-exemplifying exemplars which concrete things are modeled on. As we give that up and say, well, yeah, it's better to talk about properties. We avoid a lot of paradoxes of like there being a form of filth which is filthy, that there's perfect filthiness and all of this kind of gibberish. We avoid all that, all of those problems, and say that universals are actually properties or relations, like triangularity, or in the case of a relation, betweenness or besideness, or whatever relation you like. We say that these shareable properties or relations are universals. The Platonic or extreme realist holds that these properties or relations exist independently and apart from substances. The Aristotelian view is known as moderate realism. It says that the properties or relations only exist insofar as they are exemplified by substances or things, and therefore they do not exist apart from substances. So those were the two main departures that Aristotle made from the Platonic view. Modern-day Platonists accept one of them, but not the other. They accept the idea that universals are not exemplars or forms. They admit that they're properties, and therefore that they don't, in general, partake of themselves. But they resist the idea that a universal must be exemplified in a substance. Whereas modern-day Aristotelians, following Aristotle, say that universals won't exist unless they are exemplified in something. So that would make, at least for Aristotelians, universals would turn out to be, at least in principle, temporal entities, since they could come into being or pass away if various species came into existence or went extinct, like biological species, right? So catness and dogness could either come into being or pass away with the creation of a new species or the extinction of a species. So you'd actually have properties coming into existence or going out of existence. So if there was a mutation and a new species of bacteria arose, a new universal would come into being at that point. For the Aristotelian view. For Plato, though, they would have always existed as abstract possibilities. Same thing with shapes, right? So you might imagine an infinitude of shapes which have never been exemplified, like 7-dimensional cubes and all kinds of things, right? So for the Platonists, those would exist, right? Because there are these necessary, unchanging absolute truths about 7-dimensional cubes that we can study in advanced geometry class, whatever. But for Aristotle, these wouldn't exist unless they were actually exemplified somewhere, unless there was actually a 7-dimensional place somewhere where these properties were exemplified. So that might fit in better with the kind of David Lewis view of possible worlds that I was talking about the other day, right? Which would say, they are exemplified in one of these other inaccessible possible worlds out there. But that would be a steep price to pay. All right, so you had Plato's theory, and then Aristotle's theory, and then after the fall of Rome, right, the Romans kept Greek philosophy sort of alive for a long time, but then Rome fell, and Western Europe was plunged into chaos, and you got the Middle Ages. Right? And during the Middle Ages, at first, they had very little Aristotle, as I may have mentioned earlier, because they couldn't read Greek. It was all Greek to them. It was all gibberish. They had like 1 or 2 very short essays that had been translated into Latin by Boethius that Aristotle had written, one of which was the Categories, which had a lot of cool stuff in it on metaphysics. But other than that, they didn't have very much. They had a little bit of just a fragment of Aristotle's work on interpretation. They didn't have Aristotle's logic. So they didn't have much to go on there. Basically, they followed Aristotle's theory of universals during the Middle Ages. There really weren't any Platonists. They didn't have Plato's. Plato's works weren't accessible at all until much later. At any rate, prior to that, there was a transitional figure who wrote a commentary on Aristotle's Categories. He was a Neoplatonic philosopher named Porphyry. And he was a follower of Plotinus, who was also a Neoplatonic philosopher. Neoplatonic philosophers blended together themes from Plato and Aristotle. And they were sort of the philosophers of waning antiquity, writing close to the time that the ancient world collapsed and the Middle Ages sort of kicked in. And the early parts of the Middle Ages were called the Dark Ages because things were really bad. It was like 300-year-long like economic depression with no strong central government, where basically the church was the Catholic Church, headquartered in Rome, with the Pope was basically the thing that kept Europe functional. And you didn't have nation states. You had sort of castles, right? And sort of warlords here and there. Not very much, no educational institutions to speak of, except for church schools that basically taught people enough Latin so that they could read scripture, and that was about it. But anyway, before that, before Rome fell, you had these Neoplatonic philosophers. Now, Porphyry raised three questions about these universal entities, which helped shape philosophical thought about the problem of universals during the Middle Ages, especially after Aristotle's works were recovered in the 12th century, when people in Western Europe acquired the ability to read Greek, which eventually occurred as they interacted more with people in the Islamic world and in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, which survived, called the Byzantine Empire, till about 1453, actually. The Eastern Roman Empire was called Constantinople. But then it fell to the Turks in 1453 and became Istanbul and fell under the Islamic rule. But until then, it was an Orthodox Christian, Eastern Orthodox Christian nation, and considered itself the surviving remnant of the Roman Empire in the East, all the way until 1453 AD. So technically, Rome wasn't completely defunct until then. Even though in the West, it basically fell apart, right, about 400 AD or something like that, give or take. Rome was completely overwhelmed by barbarian invasions around then. But anyway, so Porphyry was prior to that, right, prior to the fall of Rome. Right? And he raised three questions about these universal entities. He said, what is the story with these universals? First of all, do they exist apart from our minds or only in our minds? So is triangularity or catness something that exists apart from the mind or only in the mind? Right, so according to a view known as conceptualism about universals, universals only exist as mental constructions or concepts that humans create in their minds. So the idea would be triangularity is something we construct in our brain or our mind. We concoct an image, say, of a triangle in our mind, and that's what triangularity is. And objects are triangles insofar as they match up or don't match up with that mental image that we have in our mind. That makes sense. So this would be a very anti-Platonic view. It's considered a form of particularism, concretism, and nominalism, because these mental images would be particular, concrete events or processes in our minds or brains, right? these mental images, like of a triangle that you could. So you could image, right, like a triangle in your mind's eye, right? You close your eyes, right? Draw the sides and stuff and have it in there. And the same thing, you could image a cat, right, or a dog. And so the idea would be that dogness and catness are just these things, and that if we have Rover, Fido, and Spot, or triangle 1, triangle 2, and triangle 3, we can say that the triangles are triangles or the dogs are dogs because each of them in each case resembles the image that we have in our brain or in our mind, depending on whether you're a materialist and you believe that minds are brains, or you believe that minds exist separately as spiritual beings. But either way, you'd be particularistic, nominalistic, and concretistic in saying that all we need here is some kind of image. So the they refers to the universals. Right? Do the universals exist apart from our minds or only in our minds? So that was question 1. So if you answer this affirmatively, then you're a conceptualist, and you say universals are mental constructs. It's called conceptualism. Universals are mental constructions. This view in the Middle Ages was famously championed by William of Ockham, who also said that we should not multiply things unnecessarily. This fit in with that maxim of metaphysical or ontological methodology, because it said that we're not going to introduce otherworldly or additional entities like triangularity and catness. We're just going to stick with particular objects and events like images in our mind and stuff like that, rather than introducing these shareable properties. So nothing here would be literally shared, right? It would just be that there'd be a particular image, and other images would either match up. Other objects would either match up with that image or not match up with that image. So that's the conceptualist. If you answer no to this, then you're going to be you're going to say that universals exist apart from the mind. So the next question was, if they exist apart, are they corporeal or incorporeal? So if they exist apart from the mind, are these universals bodily things, or are they non-bodily entities of some sort? So Aristotle seems to have held that these properties or universals do exist apart from the mind, but that they're not corporeal. Thanks. What's an example of somebody who thought that they exist apart from the mind but are corporeal things? There was a guy like that. The medieval philosopher Roscelin, who's considered to be the father of nominalism, held that universals are actually corporeal things. And so there's nothing otherworldly or universalistic or abstract or anything weird about them. He said, in fact, that universals are just the words that we use, considered as brute physical things. And he famously said that universals are just puffs of air. So for him, the thing that was the universal was the sound, because in the Middle Ages they focused on words, not having any significant ability to write down anything. They didn't have paper. They had a few scrolls, like with parchment, whatever. You had to write all this. Right? Have you ever seen the commercial about the Xerox machine that they used to have years ago, right? Where they had the monks writing out the copies of everything, taking them like years to make one copy, and the guy with the Xerox machine was like making hundreds of copies every minute, whatever. So writing wasn't something that was much in the minds of people in the Middle Ages. It basically, you had to memorize everything, and they had like maybe one scroll of it somewhere in Europe, somewhere where it existed. But the view could be taken over to not just puffs of air, but also inscriptions if you really want to. I mean, so you could say universals are either puffs of air or inscriptions on paper. Either way, they're just physical things. So for Russell and a universals are just the vocalizations or puffs of air that come out of our mouth when we say a certain predicate word, like dog or triangle or cat. And he said these are the things that are predicated of many. So what's predicated of Morris, Felix, and Garfield is the physical puffs of air that are formed when we say cat. That vocalization or sound, or if we write the word cat, so extending his view to inscriptions, which would be a concatenation of chalk marks, very thin, but still a physical object. That would be the thing which is the universal for Rosalind. It's just the physical object or physical event, which is the writing down or utterance of the predicate, which is a corporeal thing. It does exist apart from the mind because it's a corporeal thing, right? So he said they exist apart and they're corporeal. So this was Rosalind. Universals are mere puffs of air, which in Latin was flatus voces, vocalizations, right? Voce, right? Voice, vocal, right? It's just what we say, the actual literal sounds are the universal. So there's nothing mysterious here. We don't need any arcane, otherworldly, or strange, shareable entities or anything. It's just the predicate, as spoken or written, I suppose. That is the universal. So he would say they exist apart from the mind, but they're corporeal. The third question, if they exist apart, so Porphyry was just like laying out the logical space of different positions one might hold on the metaphysical status of these things like catness and triangularity and stuff, right? Do they exist in the mind? Are they concepts of the mind? Or are they corporeal things like words, which could be of a purely physical object or physical event nature? Or are they incorporeal and exist apart from the mind, which would be taking you more towards some kind of more metaphysical view of them, like Aristotle or Plato or something along those lines? Third question, if they exist apart, do they exist only in substances? Or only apart from them? So this would be marking out the contrast between what we call extreme realism or Platonic realism in the modern sense and moderate or Aristotelian realism. The Aristotelian realist would say that they exist only in substances, that catness and dogness and triangularity only exist if there is a triangle, a cat, or a dog, and the property exists in them. If you take away the substance, the property would no longer exist. The universal property would no longer exist. There's an existential dependence. The property exists only in relation to the existence of the substance. So dogness will exist only if there are some dogs. Whereas the more Platonic view would say that they exist apart from them, that even if all dogs and triangles were annihilated, these properties would still endure or continue to exist. And even before dogs and triangles and cats were created, these properties pre-existed them. So for the Platonic view of universals, universals are prior to substances, whereas for the Aristotelian, substances are prior to universals. You must have the substance, otherwise you can't have the universal. But for the Platonist, you can have universals that are completely unexemplified ever. Like, for example, a regular polygon with a googolplex of sides. A googolplex is a number which is 10 to the 10 to the 100th power, which is a lot of sides. You can't actually construct a googolplex polygon in our world according to what modern science says, because modern science says there aren't anything close to that number of particles in the universe. So if that's true, there won't ever be any googolplex regular hexagons, right? They would look exactly like circles, by the way, and be indistinguishable from circles by any empirical test that we could perform. But they wouldn't be circles. They just have like teensy-weensy little straight sides, right? So Plato would say that property exists and we can mathematically study it and all of that. Aristotle would say if it's not actually exemplified, then it doesn't exist, even though someday it might exist. I guess David Lewis would say, well, in some possible world it exists, right? There are those things. There is such a property, though not in our observable universe, not in the actual world, but in other possible worlds that are equally real ontologically. There are those properties. So in closing, I'll just say that it's important to distinguish two different senses of the term universal. In the medieval sense, a universal can be defined as anything that can be predicated or said of many things. So that would allow us to say that a puff of air is a universal. In the modern sense, which is a different sense, a universal is something that can be exemplified by two or more things at a single time. So you see the difference between the two. So in the modern sense, a puff of air couldn't be a universal because it can't be exemplified by two or more things at a given time, even though dogness can be. So basically, the modern sense says that a universal is a shareable property or relation. The medieval sense is broader. It says that a universal is anything that can be predicated or said of many things, which would include not only shareable properties or relations, but also things like concepts and even words or inscriptions or puffs of air. So in one way, it's more useful to have the broader medieval sense, because that opens up, that enables us to say or opens up the possibility of saying that there are all these different theories of what universals are, including theories that, so to speak, reduce them to puffs of air or corporeal objects of some sort. And these are views that we do want to consider the possibility of. One of the main criticisms, I'll say as a final point, of Rosselin's view was made by his student Abelard. You may have heard of the tale of Abelard and Heloise, where Abelard came to sort of a sorry conclusion in that story. But at any rate, Abelard was one of the leading philosophers of the time and basically put the University of Paris, which was the first major medieval university, on the map. He was like the superstar that everyone came to study with when universities first got going in the Middle Ages, beginning our great tradition leading up, then culminating in UNCG as a modern example. But that's why we wear cap and gown at graduation, because they wore those all the time, so they wouldn't freeze to death in the drafty buildings that they had back in those days. Abelard criticized Rosselin. He said, if a universal is just a puff of air, then why wouldn't there be universals for nonsensical puffs of air like Jabberwocky and snark and things like that? He said any puff of air then would be a universal, right? But there is no way to say that this object, and this object are all Jabberwockies, because Jabberwocky is just a nonsensical word that Lewis Carroll made up and doesn't signify anything. Abelard said really the only way to make sense of this view is to shift over to some form of conceptualism. That is to say that it's only a puff of air that has a meaning that expresses a universal. But then the question arises, what is it for a puff of air to be meaningful? And a likely account of that was Occam's view, that a puff of air is meaningful when it represents or signifies a concept in the mind, and universals become these mental concepts rather than just the linguistic sound that's uttered. So conceptualism sort of superseded the kind of really brute, primitive nominalism of Rosselin, where it was just the physical event or inscription that was the universal, in favor of a more conceptualist view, which still has many of the same virtues. We're still not admitting that there are metaphysical universals over and above things in the physical world. Okay, so next time we'll look at some of the arguments that were put forward early on in the debate in order to defend the existence of a realist position on universals, that is either an Aristotelian or Platonic view of universals, as opposed to a nominalistic view, either a linguistic or a conceptualistic view of universals. So we'll get into those arguments next time.